G'day, welcome. Thank you very much for coming and letting me tell you my story. And I suppose it's a story that comes in two halves. The first half is to paint you a picture, a very sad picture of the pathetic child I was and the troubled adolescent I was. And then the second part of it, in a way, is a tale of redemption, which is how I solved these problems through the building of a mud brick house. So I'll just do the pathetic, sad part of the story quickly, because Augustine Burroughs has done it better than I can. But it is a sad and pathetic story of a bookish, wan child who always felt. Look, I think, to be honest, how many of us felt. I think it's almost a commonplace of adolescence that you feel you're the odd one out, and I certainly felt that, and I felt that. Certainly growing up in the middle 70s in Australia, that the definition of masculinity that was on offer to me was not a definition I cared for at all. It seemed to me a straitjacket that you would pull on more than a smorgasbord of opportunities. It seemed to involve a particular attitude to women, to beer drinking and to sport, which I certainly did not hold. And so I felt very alienated, if it doesn't sound too pretentious, from my own gender, from my own masculinity. Now, I think as a grown-up looking back on that the world was nowhere near as restrictive as I thought it was, and that there were many more people in my position than I thought at the time. But of course, you form your personality as much through your misconceptions of the world around you as you do from some sort of real interpretation of what is happening. So I did feel very alienated, I think, from my school group and from the other males of the time. I was terrible at sport. The rugby union situation was not good for me. It mainly involved me running around with the coach shouting, "Pick up the ball, Glover!" and me yelling back, "Can't, sir, might get hurt, sir." I literally did ballet. I literally did ballet when I was in high school, which was fairly game. The teacher was delighted to have one boy among her 32 girls, although she did say, it would be good if Richard could develop his arm muscles so that he could pick up at least one of the girls more than a foot off the ground. So I wasn't a big success at that. I had one fight at school, and predictably it was over books. I was sitting at lunchtime on my own reading a book on the grass. Does a picture form? All on my own reading a book. It was P.G. Wodehouse, my favourite. And somebody came up and stepped on my book. And perhaps overly influenced by my reading material, I jumped up and said, "Dash it, man, you can't step on another chap's book," and took a swing at him. Well, as you can imagine, the phrase "dash it all, man, old chap" did not go down very well in a Canberra high school in 1974, and yes, the fight did not go well, and so the school would continually to redouble its efforts to make a man of me. They'd sent me off to woodwork, in which all the other boys would be making these sort of intricate wooden models of the Eiffel Tower, and I was given what was optimistically called a breadboard to make, which is just an oblong of wood which you'd sand away at. That was a breadboard. And, in the middle of all this, when I was about 14, this is the sort of, I'll give you the comic version rather than the too sadder version of this, but when I was 14, my mother ran away with my English teacher, who she met at parent-teacher. Finally a sob of sympathy. And my father was so heartbroken by this, he went back to England. Now, as I said, this is not a sob story because I was living in a very nice middle-class house with a pool in Canberra, so I don't want you to feel too sympathetic to me, but I was 14 and my mother had disappeared, and so had my father. Now, it must be said that my father in the end came back, and in the interim he did move a friend of his into the house eventually. But my wife still says about me at age 14 that Richard never really left home. Home left him. So, I hope that paints a picture of this very poor and pathetic and alienated adolescent. At the same time, not content with, destroying myself in this way, I threw myself into Canberra Youth Theatre, which at the time was very much kind of first-wave feminism. Everything's sort of 10 years later in Canberra. And so, you know, it was as if Germaine Greer had just written her book. And it was you know, we were all very kind of hairy, and it was sort of like Cousin It, really. We used to do these sort of crazy rehearsals in which we'd go down to the south coast for sort of weeks on end and rehearse these plays, which were all feminist diatribes about rape in war. And there was a lot of... I remember the subject matter, the ideology of it, and I remember the pubic lice. You know, there were two memories of those years. And you know, and that left me with a sensitivity about gender, which I hope stays with me still. I'm not kind of knocking it in a way, but for a troubled teenager, it was a curious combination of having this very sort of blokey school, which schoolmates who I kind of had difficulty with, and then this being part of this feminist collective for most of the rest of my time. And I remember, probably at about age 16 or 17, one of the girls in the theatre club said to me and one of the other boys, could you two men move that roster over there? And both of us stopping, Felix and I stopping, as if she'd slapped us in the face because she'd called us men. And to our you know, entirely mental ears, it was like she'd called us rapists. And we really wouldn't move until she sort of said, well, you know, Felix and Richard, could you do that? Now, I don't tell that story with any pride. I mean, it was a sign of the sort of galloping insanity of the time and the galloping insanity of my own psyche. And, of course, there's no way you can stay like that as conflicted about. If you've got dangly bits, if you are a man, you can't remain in the situation where you're entirely alienated from your own gender. It's an impossible situation to be. But I think that, you know, to summarise, was the situation I was in when I was 16 or 17. What happens then? Well, for me, the most significant story in what happens then takes a few years, because I'm at university and I've met the love of my life quite recently, Deborah. And she's got a friend and he's got a girlfriend, and we're all kind of good buddies together, and we all have those parties that everyone has, those, you know, drunken barbecues. And at the end of one of them, after the consumption of I don't know if you remember port used to be available in bladders? Or is no one as economically disadvantaged as we were? But you used to be able to buy it from wineries in 12-litre bladders, which you'd then decant yourself into bottles. And it came out not at sort of $1 a glass, but like about 20 cents a glass, or maybe even 12 cents a glass for a schooner glass of port. So we had these fabulous nights where we'd drink this stuff down. And one particular night, Philip said, who knew a bit more, you know, he was a bit more of a proper man, and he actually knew a few things about carpentry and woodwork, and he'd made his own dining room table and things like that. And he said, which is a phrase which has been repeated at Australian barbecues for 100 years and will be for 100 years to come, why don't we buy a block of land and build our own place? Now, who hasn't been in one of those bullshit discussions at some point and everyone says, oh yeah, let's do that, yeah, that'll be great, and then in the morning you sober up and you don't do it. For some reason on this occasion we kind of didn't ever sober up. We kept on talking about it, and we found ourselves looking at the ads in the paper, and in a way, looking back at it, it was this weird moment of opportunity, because I think a few years later we'd have all had mortgages and kids, and we wouldn't have been able to afford it, and years before we were still students, but we all just had our first jobs, and the land, we found this block of land which was $27,000, which between four people with a bit of saving and a bit of credit card and a bit of 20 cents from down the bottom of the couch, you could just about raise. And once we'd seen that block and realised we could afford it, it was an intoxicating idea. And I suppose a particularly intoxicating idea for me, because even though it was absurd that I could build a house, I think I had sense enough to know that there was something in this for me, in this strange attitude I had to masculinity. Here was somebody offering me, in a way, the ultimate male adventure, building, using tools, trying to build something out of the ground. And so I kind of threw myself into it. And we found this block of land which is near Wombeyan Caves, which is about an hour. You go to Mittagong and you turn right, and it's really rugged country that's not really usable for much else, but it's incredibly beautiful and harsh and spectacular. And we found this block. And by this time, of course, we had no money left at all because we'd spent it all on the block. And it was that idea that got us intoxicated about mud bricks, because we thought, here's a building material you can use straight away. You don't need anything. You just need a bucket of water and some mud, and you can start making a useful building material. And so we bought the block and we set to, and we found that the land was almost totally constructed of rocks, and it was almost impossible to find any mud. But we kept on going. And to make mud bricks, you basically dig a thing that looks like a bathtub in the ground, and you throw soil into it, and you throw a bit of hay into it, and you throw buckets of water, and then you have to mix it. Now, any sensible person would use a concrete mixer, petrol-driven concrete mixer. We were not sensible. We were trying to do it by hand. So you get these shovels and hoes, and you try to move it, and you decide very quickly that mud brick is a building material designed by chiropractors as a way of drumming up trade. And Philip and my backs were sort of aching and hurting, and is it on the first day? We couldn't get the mix. We just couldn't make it mix without killing our backs. And there was this wonderful point where the two women said, "No, you're doing it all wrong," as women do, and stripped off most of their clothing, and hopped into the mud together, and kind of wrestled with each other. And Philip and I stood back from this scene and thought, two half-naked women wrestling in mud, and yet still producing a useful building material in the process. Doesn't get any better than this. And it didn't, because they didn't ever do it again. But which went back to the... So we started, building and building and building, and we made something like 3,000 mud bricks, and we slowly started teaching ourselves how to build. And I suppose the main arc of this story is simply time. The whole thing in the end has taken us 25 years. The first building took 17 years. We're currently building another building, which has so far taken us 8 years. And it's just a story of persistence, really. I think that there are so many American self-help books about the glories of doing something perfectly, about the glories of absolute 100% perfection. And this book is not about that. This book is a paean of praise to the joys of doing something a bit crap. And a bit, we really didn't know what we were doing, and each stage we'd try to learn how to do the footings. We'd get a book, we'd read about it, we'd ask somebody about it, we'd have a go at it, we'd do it wrong, we'd do it again. And it's still, the place is full of these wonky angles, it's full of tiles that don't quite sit properly, but still, it is the most beautiful building in the world. Of course it is, because it's the building we built ourselves. And I look back at something like after the Second World War, and so many Australians built their own place, and so many Australians would be willing to retile their bathroom or jump up on the roof and put some new tin on the roof. And of course some people still do that, but I think for most of us we've allowed ourselves to become really de-skilled about these things, that because the house in town is our main asset in life, the main financial asset, we feel it has to be schmick and it has to be perfect. And so even the simplest task, you have to get a tradesman in to do it. And you end up living in, a house in a way is a kind of machine that we live inside. And you end up living inside these machines feeling that you can't touch it, that you don't know how to operate it, almost scared of the envelope in which you're spending most of your life. And I think that's a terrible shame, and almost a kind of alienating and spiritually deadening experience. And the great virtue of bush block or any of this sort of amateur building is that you realise you can do it. And I suppose I would say to people, if I can do it, that entirely dysfunctional, crazed boy that I described to you, who didn't know one end of a hammer from another, if I could end up teaching myself these skills and feeling confident enough to do it in a way that's a bit crap, then anybody can do it. And I suppose that was part of my realisation over the long course of this of building. A couple of other realisations. I realised that all we really had ever was persistence. My producers send me up because, when you're working on a radio show, there are endless stories. People cycle across the Nullarbor, or they do a canoe to New Zealand, or they climb Everest with one leg tied behind their back and an oxygen tank on their head. And they write a book about it and they want to come on the radio. And I'm, a little bit against it. Because I always think, oh, why don't you stay at home and look after your families, you know? Why are you doing this? I'm entirely bored by them, you know. And I've always been much more impressed by stories of achievement over time, I suppose, of people who've run a small business for 30 years and kept it going and not gone bankrupt and not cheated the tax department too many times, of people who've managed to build, you know, raise a family and no one's ended up in prison. Fantastic. These great stories of persistence. So this is a story of people who had no skill. I mean, Philip had some skills, but people had no skills, who had no ability, who had no patience, who fought with each other, who did all this stuff, but had persistence and just did it over time. And the story of the time, you know, is partly explained by power tools. We had no power tools. We didn't feel we could afford a generator. So we built the whole first building just with saws and hammers and brace and bit. And there was glory in that too, you know, these working sites where there was no noise, there was just the birds and the sunshine and this sound. But, you know, it obviously, you know, it's incredibly time consuming. We felt we couldn't afford bulldozers and so forth, so we would excavate by hand these enormous areas. And so that was part of the story, just trying to do this without power tools. And then after 17 years, we finally finished the main building. And there was that kind of moment where we were sitting on the veranda with the beer and the newspaper, the sunshine. We've finally done it. 3,000 mud bricks, back hurt, everything, no power tools, fantastic, done it. And at that point, with perfect timing, my younger son, who was 14 years old, said words to the effect of, look, this is all very well, but my older brother had a chance to take part in this. I didn't. That seems a bit unfair. You know, don't you think you owe it to me, you know, to build another building? And, you know, and I suppose we were both like 45 or 47 or something like that by then. Our bodies were aching. We felt every piece of wood we lifted up felt so much heavier than it did when we first lifted it up. But of course, it's an amazing, and I really had a real visceral desire to say, no, go away. I really did. But of course you can't, and you realise that as a father that this is a great offer for any father, for a teenage son about to enter into that period of adolescence, of sometimes troubled adolescence, to say, let's do something together is an amazing offer. And I say in the book, I think when I was contemplating it and really trying to figure out a way of getting out of it, in a way, I said to myself, to father is not only a noun, it's a verb, you know, it's a doing word. And if called upon, of course you have to do it. And this second time round, though, you know, we're 47. I'm working for the ABC. I'm flush with cash, so we buy a generator. It was this wonderful moment when, you know, the Industrial Revolution finally arrived. You know, 250 years after it sailed into Lancashire, it's finally there. And vroom goes the generator, and a power saw. Vroom, oh, gee whiz! These power tools are great. You know, vroom, fantastic. And so we're in the process of buying this, of building this second place. The lessons of all this, for me, were partly, I suppose, to go back to what I began with masculinity. That I think through the project I'd found a way, and it's an obvious thing, a struggle I guess most men don't have actually, but I'd found a way to feel good about being a bloke, about being a man. I felt good about these manly virtues. Now, that's not to say that women don't have these virtues, but I think there are these things you could call manly virtues about persistence and heavy lifting and a certain aggression when it comes to belting in a clout. And I felt pride and pleasure in having them, and I felt pride and pleasure in my body and my body's ability to do these tasks to some extent or other. And I also think I started to reflect much more deeply about that time at school and started to realise that I had misinterpreted what had happened to a large extent, and that really probably 95% of the people, of the Australian males of the 1970s, were actually more like me than they were like the 5% who seemed to define the Ocker ideal. Not to say that they were all like me in particular, but they weren't necessarily like the 5%. And I kind of suddenly realised that there was this amazing mathematical sleight of hand whereby 5% of the male population had managed to convince the 95% that we were the odd ones and that they were normal. How does that work in mathematics? And we were all, and there was much more diversity actually in the males who were around than I ever understood, and I think than the culture allowed for either. And of course that goes on to this day. And I look at young Australian men now, and I thank God that they are not troubled to anywhere near the same extent by these things as my generation was. And I think they do realise that it is a smorgasbord, or it can be a smorgasbord of choices for people, masculinity. It doesn't have to feel like this terrible straitjacket. And so I look at the building now, and there's a great I don't know if anyone's read Jung's autobiography, but it's a really beautiful book, and it's very accessible actually. It's not like his theoretical writings. And it is a wonderful chapter in it where he describes building his own place in the hills above Zurich. And he writes in the end that this place feels like a representation in stone of his innermost thoughts, is what he says, and how he feels that he's been reborn in stone. And I feel in the end that's the way I feel about this building, that it's a representation, well, in mud, it's a representation in mud of my innermost thoughts, of my slight struggle with my own masculinity and its resolution, of this great friendship I've had with Philip, who's taught me to value these parts of myself, of my great kind of feisty partner whose ability with a chainsaw is something to behold, and of course to my kids, who then kind of threw their weight in and took part in it. So that's that's I guess the building I've got. I've talked about it a couple of times in the last week, the most bizarre of which has been at Glee Books, where Tommy Dean interviewed me. I don't know if you're aware of Tommy Dean from Thank God It's Friday, the American comedian, but it was the most bizarre literary interview I've ever experienced. Wonderful, but bizarre. He had 3 questions. His first question was, "This is your least funny book, but in a good way. Discuss," which I think is true. It is my least funny book. His second question was, I notice, I can't do Tommy's accent, but I notice you say it took 17 years to build a bathroom, and up to that point you went into the woods with a roll of toilet roll and a mattock. "Yes," I said. "Did you mark the poos so that you didn't dig up the same ground to make the mud bricks?" Because if you did, the book shouldn't be called The Mud House. It should be called The House of Poo. And his third question was, there's one section in the book where I'm describing kind of Deborah leaning into me and discussing these early plans. I say, her soft breast, touching my arm. "You say that Deborah has soft breasts. How soft?" Naturally, I answered, "Very." Thank you very much for listening. I compelled the Dobell Prize. This book is partly about drawing too. It's about kind of how much easier it is to draw pictures on a page than it is to draw to actually build something. I drew this first off as was said, on coasters and so forth, and then it became real over a long time. And with the second house, it was all drawn by my son in these beautiful pictures which became more and more ornate. And it's much easier to draw these buildings than actually make them. And the story of his building is very much one of dreams, sometimes galloping slightly ahead of reality. He'd only just finished drawing it using all these principles of the golden mean, the classical golden mean that he'd learnt about at school, and he'd drawn it beautifully. But we hadn't done anything at all. And he came home, he's now 17, but this is when he's about 15. He came home and he'd stopped off on the way home from school at St Vincent de Paul and bought 2 little waiters' uniforms for $1. And I said, "Why have you got those?" And he explained that his dream for this place was to turn it into a bar. And the waiters' uniforms were for the staff to wear. I suggested that maybe we should build the foundations first before we start dressing the staff. But so it has gone to this day, and we've got a very good set of ping pong bats, drinking coasters and waiters' uniforms for when we've finished the building. We've only got 500 mud bricks to go. So if any of you are free next weekend, please come up. Thank you very much for listening.